Hello everyone, this is the mini video lecture for Political Science 105, Presidency and Congress, and our chapter is focusing on the firing, retiring, and expiring of presidents. So if you recall, because this is for a class that has already ended, what we're going to do is these video lectures can go a maximum of 15 minutes each, and we will probably have about 2 parts to this lecture. So check the Moodle page for part 1 and part 2, and we will be covering much of the information that was covered in Nelson since we were not able to discuss it during the class sessions where we had the power outages. So this lesson plan actually covers everything that we covered that day, which includes the teach-in session where we discussed the interaction between climate change and the wildfires, as well as our discussion of Nelson. So this is just to document the session that we had. So in terms of our objectives, we investigated the interaction between climate change and the wildfires. We also, the chapter reflects on the constitutional provisions for removing and replacing a president. We will also discuss the constitutional amendments and attempts at clarifying the succession of a president, and then we'll analyze some specific cases that are offered in the chapter that illustrate the various methods for removing and or replacing a president. So moving past our teach-in on the wildfires and going to the creation of the presidency, it's important to note that this was considered a bold move to even create an executive branch in the Constitution as part of the new American government. And the reason it was considered bold is because, first of all, the precedent in the United States up until that point was to create a weak executive. So, for example, the Articles of Confederation didn't even provide for an executive branch, and the governors who served as executives of their states were generally pretty weak with very few powers, most of the power being left to the legislative branch. So it was a bold move because it was something that had not been done before. However, the founders wanted what we talked about a little bit, energy, the sense of energy in the executive branch. And what that meant was that the executive branch had to not only be separate from Congress, a separate branch, but also independent, which meant that the president needed to have some substantial powers of their own so that they weren't always at the mercy of the legislative branch. So those are a couple reasons why this was considered a bold move. And then even though there were fears that the creation of an executive branch might actually slide into a monarchy, which is similar to what the United States had just thrown off through the Revolutionary War, even though those fears existed, this is another reason why creation of the presidency was considered a bold move, because it was done so even though there were these fears about what an executive branch could turn into. But with those fears in mind, 2 types of emergency exits were created in order to end the term of a flawed presidency or a problematic presidency due to either impeachment and removal or disability. So those are kind of the 2 general categories of that were kept in mind during the creation of the presidency. So these 2 types of emergency exits, so this should actually be 2 categories. Impeachment and removal is 1 category, and then disability is another. So when we talk about impeachment and removal, that's where the phrase high crimes and misdemeanors comes from. And when we talk about disability, or when we think about disability as another type of emergency exit, this is based on this idea of the inability to discharge the duties of the office, duties and powers of the office. So getting into 4 methods for removal from office, any kind of removal really can only happen 1 of 4 ways: either death, impeachment and removal, resignation, or disability. So those are kind of the 4 general categories. And then there are some constitutional articles that focus on what happens if a president's term needs to end prematurely. The first article in the Constitution is Article 1, which focuses on the legislative branch. The second article is Article 2, which focuses on the executive branch. So Article 1 really says, talks about the fact that if the president is removed, the in order for the president to be removed, the legislative branch has to draw up those articles and actually hold a trial. So the powers of removal of a president fall to Congress, which is why that discussion happens in Article 1. The second constitutional article for the premature end of a president's term occurs in Article 2, which focuses on the executive branch. And what this article talks about is the fact that justification for impeachment can fall under treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. So it's really kind of talking about the responsibility of the executive and reasons, talking to the executive or considering the executive branch reasons why a president could be impeached. Okay, so thinking about presidential succession, there are some constitutional amendments that are key, as well as some attempts at clarifying or refining these amendments, some which have been successful, some which have not. So first, the 20th Amendment talked about or considered what would happen, especially in the case of the death of the president. And so basically, the 20th Amendment states that if the president-elect, the newly elected president, dies before the start of their term, then the newly elected vice president becomes president, or the vice president-elect. So as you know, we have elections in November, but the president's term doesn't start until that following January. So, for example, if a president was elected in November but then died in December, then they would be considered president-elect, but they never had an opportunity to actually occupy the office. So if that happens, the 20th Amendment said that by Inauguration Day in January, if no new presidential candidate has gotten a majority of electoral votes or the support of a majority of state delegations in the House, so this means when the president-elect dies, if no new candidate has basically come forward, gotten electoral votes, or gotten the state delegations in the House to vote for them, then the vice president-elect will step up and become the president-elect until the Senate elects a new president by majority vote. So it sounds relatively complicated and convoluted by our terms now, but it was really just an attempt to continue to clarify what will happen or what should happen if a newly elected president dies before the beginning of their term. Now, the 25th Amendment makes this line of succession a bit clearer because Section 1 of the 25th Amendment clearly states that if the president is removed or disabled under any of those four conditions that I just mentioned, then the vice president shall become president. So there's no need to go out and find a new president and have them have another election and gain electoral votes, etc. The vice president becomes president, relatively clear. And then Section 2 of the 25th Amendment says, if the vice presidency becomes vacant, then a new one must be appointed. So that, again, it precludes the necessity of having a new election, finding a new and separate vice president. And so even though we will talk about the timeline of succession, in reality, because of the 25th Amendment, it is clear that the vice president becomes president if the president is removed or disabled under any of the conditions that we talked about, then the vice president becomes president. It also makes clear that, for example, if President Trump was removed and then Mike Pence the Constitution now would clearly provide for Mike Pence to become president, but then the vice presidency would become vacant, and then the new president, Mike Pence, would be allowed to appoint a new vice president. So this is the line of succession, and in reality, that's kind of where succession would generally stop, although we will talk about kind of who would be next in line just in case several of the leaders were disabled or incapacitated at the same time or impeached at the same time. But these two sections of the 25th Amendment clarified this line of succession a lot more. Now, the Presidential Succession Act was actually revised several times. So the general term Presidential Succession Act is referring to this process of not only passing the legislation, but then returning to it, refining it, passing new legislation with the same name, etc. So in 1792, the first Presidential Succession Act was passed, and basically it started to outline this succession of the presidency, which means who comes next, who succeeds who. So It offered that the president pro tempore of the Senate should become president if the president is disabled, or if there is no president tempore of the Senate, then the Speaker of the House should become president. So this was a different line than what we know of today. So that was the first presidential succession act. It's also important to note that President Truman, while he was president, he believed that the office of the president should be filled by an elected official rather than the vice president stepping in. So he tried to lobby Congress to make that change. However, the congressional vote failed. But then moving on to the 1947 Presidential Succession Act, much of what Truman wanted actually came to be passed, because the vice president under this act, if the president is disabled, the vice president is next, and then the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and then the president pro tempore of the Senate, and then finally the heads of the cabinet members in the executive branch, they would be kind of the next folks in line. So this is the timeline that we know of, that we're more familiar with now. It was revised in 2006, and so this is the line of succession that we know today. Also, just important to note that because of the fact that there were 3 assassinations, President Lincoln, President Arthur, and President McKinley, that led Congress to authorize the Secret Service, which was already created and focused on finding counterfeiters. It led Congress to authorize the Secret Service to guard the president. And while there are definite benefits, your text also lays out a couple of interesting, maybe unanticipated problems, such as the fact that, or an unanticipated effect, because the Secret Service, while protecting the president, they insulate them to the degree that it's rare that they would ever have a spontaneous encounter with the citizens, and that can be seen as an important aspect of the presidency. So moving on to think about disability and the 25th Amendment. So there are 3 possible situations that could lead to what we would consider, a disability situation. First, the president is unable. Well, in all 3 of the situations, the president can't do their job. They're unable to discharge their powers and duties of the office. So in the first situation, the president is disabled in some way, and the president realizes that. Maybe, they've been hurt or injured, but they are clear enough to understand that, I'm disabled, I can't discharge my duties, and therefore, what would happen in that situation? They would only need to write a letter to the Speaker and the president took pro tempore of the Senate saying, I am disabled. This allows the vice president to become the acting president. And then another letter undoes that and returns the president's powers back to them. So the president needs to write a letter stating that they're disabled and the vice president should take over all the duties and powers of the presidency, and then write another letter stating that their disability has ended and they can now take their duties and powers back. The second possible situation is that the president is disabled, but for whatever reason, maybe they can't say so. Maybe they've had a stroke or fallen in a coma and they can't actually write a letter to say so. In that case, the vice president and the cabinet need to meet, and they need to have a majority vote to declare that, yes, the president is disabled. And then again, if the president becomes able at a later date, the president would need to write that letter basically saying, I am now fully able to take on the duties and powers of my job. The third scenario is very interesting because it focuses on whether the president might claim to be able, but the vice president and the cabinet might disagree and feel that the president is disabled in some way. Maybe their mental capacity is diminished or something like that. In that case, the vice president becomes acting president until Congress resolves this issue. And it gives Congress 3 weeks to decide whether the president is disabled or not. So if there was a 2/3 vote in both the House and the Senate that yes, the president is disabled, we need to turn the powers and duties of the presidency over to the vice president, then that would transfer the power. But then the president could write a letter claiming that their health is restored, and this would set the whole process in motion again. So this concludes the first part of our mini lecture. Tune in for part 2, also on our Moodle page.